Hello and welcome back to the Developing Solutions with Sitecore Print Experience Manager video training series. In this video, we'll be looking at the Print Experience Manager core concepts. And first off, we're going to spend a little bit of time understanding the print world and the purpose of PXM, really what PXM was built and designed to solve. Next, we'll be looking at the key areas of PXM, including the architecture and the various components to the platform. So, a few facts about the print world. First off, 30% of marketing budget is typically spent on advertising agencies for sales and marketing publications. So a lot of your ad spend still tends to go to print. And the creative design process takes about 40% of the actual production time. 60% of that production time is spent correcting and reviewing documents. And 30% of that time is wasted on searching and regenerating communication material, and 90% of that communication material is used only once. And so what Print Experience Manager is built and designed to do is to improve the production time needed for that process of correcting and reviewing documents. So by having all of that information in Sitecore, by versioning that, by using Sitecore workflow, and by automatically delivering the latest version of that content to your InDesign document, you can improve that 60% number greatly. Secondly, for that 90% number, all communication materials being used only once, we have a number of customers that are using Print Experience Manager to quickly and easily deliver time-sensitive material. So for example, daily itineraries or agendas or menus, things like that, where that information exists in Sitecore because it's being used for other web purposes, can also be used and piped very easily for print output as well, and basically eliminating that time for redoing and regenerating that communication material entirely, because that can be automated. And what that does is that leaves a lot of that production time for allowing your designers to spend more time actually doing creative design. Print Experience Manager, of course, can't replace a designer, but what it can do is automate a lot of those tasks that are just simply desktop publishing and copying and pasting and editorial review productions for designers. That can be used within Sitecore, and a lot of those tools within Sitecore, such as workflow and versioning and approval, can be used for the print world as well. So what does the current situation in the real world mean? Well, right now, often print and web really work on separate channels, and there's usually a print team doing print publications, and then there's a web team that often has to take that material and copy paste it and reproduce it for the web, or often it works the other way around. But in the past, this basically creates a lot of tension within the organization. There's things like content ownership disputes. So, who's really in charge of that final approval? Is it somebody in the print team or is it somebody in the web team? Similarly, there's a lot of duplication of business roles, including editorial and workflow approvals. There's very limited content reuse typically. And often there's really, and this is really due to, people looking at the problem from their business role, but web editors often overlook print. They don't necessarily care about the underlying structure of a document. Things like properly tagging a document with the correct author and the correct metadata for searchability means nothing to a print person, since they solely care about the final output. And similarly to a web person, those things are very much a concern for them, but they might not necessarily know or care about the HTML or the rich text that they're using the right styles. They may just simply want to get that document up there, have it work responsive, have it work properly for SEO. So they're really looking at the problems from their unique perspective and their business goals. Lastly, there's often a long manual sign-off process in production, and typically print productions aren't really geared for those processes. InDesign itself doesn't really have the tools for doing things like versioning, doesn't really have the tools for doing things like approval. And so even for simple PXM projects, let alone doing advanced projects with customizations, there's a lot of tools and processes that Sitecore and the Sitecore repository simply brings to print. Lastly, of course, compliance and governance and brand continuity failures. These are all very interrelated concepts, essentially meaning that you're using the same approved copy, you're using the same approved design on a regular basis. And so by having those designs and having that copy, again, in Sitecore versioned, workflowed, means that PXM can bring a lot of that same continuity, compliance, and governance process to the print world as well, and leveraging a lot of those same content, compliance, and governance processes within Sitecore. So after all that explanation about the web world and the print world and the different challenges and use cases that they face, in the end, what is the purpose of PXM? Well, PXM allows designers and developers to easily align print and web media. And how it does this is basically by reusing the Sitecore repository as the place for storing the content, which is probably obvious, but it's also the ability to store the actual InDesign design itself within Sitecore. And these are stored as Sitecore items, and it outputs the design as XML. And the advantage to storing each of those elements within Sitecore as separate items is this means that developers, either by workflow or other processes, can create, edit, duplicate, and automate changes to that XML, which in turn means automating the changes to that underlying document. So for example, if you're producing a catalog and it has a one-page layout of a hotel and various information on that page, normally this is something that a designer would have to copy paste many times and copy paste the content into those elements. Well, if the design is in Sitecore and it's automatable, and the content is in Sitecore and it's referenceable, and it is, then through PXM, that becomes a process that you can easily automate and send to InDesign or send to PDF automatically, making the designer's role much easier. Again, automating the boring aspects of design, leaving them to do the creative aspects, which are making new and interesting and compelling designs. So, at a high level, how does PXM work? Well, as we've gone through, Sitecore serves as the central content hub. It contains connectors to Adobe InDesign and Adobe InCopy. The purpose of this is either to have designers creating designs and inputting that into Sitecore, or designers consuming content from Sitecore based upon existing designs. It also contains a web-based interface for marketers, namely the ability to enter content, manage workflow and security, and work with multilingual versions. And lastly, it has a connector to InDesign server for automation and mass production of asset material. So let's go a little further into the key areas of PXM. First off, we have the Sitecore PXM Core. Regardless of your PXM installation, you will need to have the core installed, and this is a package install that goes on your Sitecore server. And it enables a number of things. From first and foremost, it enables the API. So this is used by PXM when generating content to go to InDesign. It also adds some web services necessary for the InDesign and InCopy connector. And lastly, within the Sitecore repository itself, it adds a number of files and a number of areas within the Sitecore site for storing your InDesign layouts and storing the templates for those items that are created as well. Next, we have the Sitecore InDesign and InCopy connectors. These are basically plugins in InDesign or InCopy which allow you to work with Sitecore content, work with PXM projects, work with workflow, and a number of other tools within InDesign. Lastly, we have the Sitecore InDesign server connector. This is very much a plugin similar to the InDesign and InCopy connectors, but the difference is this goes on the InDesign server, and so it's still receiving content from Sitecore, but instead of displaying it in InDesign for a designer to see, it outputs PDF through InDesign server. Lastly, there's the Sitecore Online Document Generator, also known as the ODG. This is a Speak application. It lives on top of Sitecore and also on top of the InDesign server connector. And so this allows you to set up things like campaigns for distributed print output. Users can come in, modify content, and run through a simple workflow-like procedure for selecting content, adding personalization, and it will output a document and send it to them. Lastly, we have the rendition builder. This allows you to do some simple output with some HTML5 and interactivity that can be layered on top of that. So it allows you to do things like flipbook viewers. And there's the Sitecore Print Studio. This is a Silverlight application. In some ways, in some respects, elements have been replaced by the online document generator, but this certainly gives you some tools like a web-based media manager and a web-based simple editor for editing those designs within a Silverlight UI. So, getting a little bit deeper again into the aspects of the core. So the core puts Adobe InDesign objects into Sitecore, and this allows us to reuse, assemble, and adjust these objects into new InDesign files. And the way we store these are through PXM projects. We also store InDesign master documents in Sitecore, and these contain style information that's used for that output. And as I mentioned, there's an API that is used for the connectors, as well as an API that can be called programmatically for outputting that information to InDesign server. Lastly, it's the ability to apply Sitecore goodness to PXM projects, but again, this can also obviously be applied to Sitecore content itself. So you can workflow, version, validate, apply security, all of those things that you typically apply to content, you can also apply to design and those design elements. But of course, those two concepts generally go hand in hand. You might have different people working with and approving design elements and different people working with and approving content elements, and some of those may overlap. So designers, of course, you might have read-only access to the content, or you may, if the designers are in fact the source of truth and final editorial approval, then of course you want to give them the ability to approve and push those changes from InDesign back into Sitecore. And so these two concepts go hand in hand, but really, again, it's the ability to apply that Sitecore goodness to those PXM projects. So briefly looking at a core installation within Sitecore, it adds this section called Print Studio here. And we're looking at a Print Studio installation that has some Print Studio projects. And really what a Print Studio project is effectively the information that InDesign expects and the structure in which InDesign builds it. And so InDesign has this concept of books. A book can have documents, a document can have a number of pages. We're replicating that structure within Sitecore. And then of course, we're also replicating those design elements within Sitecore as well. And so these are all stored as separate items within Sitecore, and they have all the properties and information that InDesign needs for the layout of this information. So this is a title field, for example, and we can see that we have XY coordinates, style information, etc., etc. But then the underlying content can either be static and stored here, or it can be coming from a Sitecore item. And so this is really one of the key concepts of PXM, is the fact that these designs, which can be used and loaded within InDesign, actually are made up of Sitecore elements in the format that InDesign expects them, married with Sitecore content. And again, as we said, the fact that these are separate items means that these can be easily reused, they can be easily copied, they can be workflowed, and they can be programmatically automated through workflow or other methods, just like any other Sitecore content. So if we look at our Sitecore templates here, you can see that we have a number of templates, and each of these templates correspond to design elements within InDesign. So things like rectangles, ellipses, lines, pages, polygons, etc., etc. All of these templates within Sitecore are elements that InDesign needs and expects when building up a document. So this is one of the things that PXM installs, is all these templates that match the format of what InDesign is expecting. Next, of course, it installs the area for storing those Print Studio projects, and it also has a number of settings which we'll be going through later. So transformation settings for mapping HTML elements to styles. We have settings for accessing and restricting content tree browsing. We have an area within the media library for storing our master documents. And so there's a number of those elements that you'll see in your content tree when you install that PXM Core. So the next major element is, of course, the InDesign connector. And these are implemented as plugins within InDesign or in Copy. And this gives you a lot of different functionality, and there's different ways of looking at the designer role. And so we'll look very simply first as the designer role as just a content consumer. So you can browse the content tree, you can open and load PXM projects and have it build designs for you. You can drag and drop elements from within the content tree onto the page. And then there's also a designer role, which is that of using the InDesign connector to build up designs and add those and import those designs within Sitecore. So right now we'll take a look at a simple example of that first case. So here we have a Print Studio project, and we have our launch Sitecore article project. And what this is it's a simple structure. So we have one page as a flow, title, author title, etc., etc. And so now if I say load, what's happening is it's pulling this project from Sitecore and basically getting the latest version of the content and marrying it up with this design structure here as well, and then loading it on the page. And this is some pretty interesting stuff. And if we take our content and we can swap out, say, workflow, for example, you can see that a lot of the elements on the page have swapped out. So we've got now the workflow title, the author, Chris, who's associated with workflow, and the content that's coming from workflow as well. And so that's really the ability to load a simple PXM project and also to change those content associations, and you can do that quickly and easily within InDesign. Now, of course, you can also use Sitecore content without having an underlying PXM project, and in this case you're simply dragging and dropping that Sitecore content from the connector onto the page. And the nice thing is PXM maintains those relationships, and so you can save this document standalone. And so here I am navigating through my Sitecore content tree. I'm at this workflow article. I can drag and drop that workflow field onto the page. I can drag and drop the abstract onto the page. I can drag and drop the body onto the page. And this includes image information in that as well. And so you can see here, this is overset text, so I would manually add another frame and continue that on and on. And so this is the type of thing that you can do as a designer without having to really understand PXM projects and their purpose and what they're used for. And you can see here that I have this references tab within the connector, and this means that I can save this document standalone onto my hard drive. I can send it to a designer, they can make changes, they can come back. The underlying content relationships are still stored within that document, and then after the fact I can hit this update button, and any changes that occurred to that content within Sitecore can be flowed onto the document that I'm working with within InDesign. And so that's really another good example of just the ability to have Sitecore as that centralized content repository, even in the simplest example. Lastly, the other major PXM component is that of online automation. So namely the ability to use InDesign Server to automatically create on-demand material. And this is usually used in conjunction with personalization. And so in our case, we're going to be using personalization with InDesign Server such that a user coming to our launch Sitecore site, they've defined a number of favorites, they've logged in, we know who they are, that favorite information is in their user profile within Sitecore, so we can produce a document with their name and the list of favorites that they've selected from within Sitecore. And so that's used with InDesign Server. And so, as I said, typically it's used with personalization. It's also used in examples like generating storefront material. So you may have a centralized way of having distributed authors come in, log in, use a web application, or use the online document generator to make simple content changes. And the end result output is on brand, the styles are correct, and you can really lock that design down so that people can only edit that information which you want them to be able to edit. And similarly, you can go one step further and go beyond giving them free text, the ability to make textual changes in the document, and go as far as just giving them the ability to select content that already exists and has been approved. And so all of this is basically enabled by the use of the automation components and InDesign Server.